everybody, and welcome to Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I get the luxury to come here every day to work, but I also travel around the watershed. And as Matt said, you see an example of what wetlands can do. Prior to CBF coming to this location 20 some odd years ago, this was all dirt. And so we have non-tidal and tidal wetlands that serve as sponges to soak up water, to protect our air through it captures carbon and doesn't release carbon, a key greenhouse gas element to minimize carbon, to minimize climate change. So wetlands and tidal restoration, both tidal and non-tidal restoration, is so key. So we applaud the county's efforts to lead by example with these two policies. We will be working closely with the county to review the policies and to further the efforts along. Let me take it back up to the watershed as a whole. This is just one example. This kind of example needs to continue throughout the watershed to both restore the bay, the Chesapeake Bay, which we are all at the federal, state, local, nonprofit level working very hard to do, and efforts must continue. But it also is the first line of defense. A healthy estuary is the first line of defense to address climate change. And so restoring and protecting estuaries is really critical. I will end with a quote from our president in our last Save the Bay magazine, Will Baker, and it reinforces the point I just made. Healthy estuaries are the first line of defense, and we must do everything possible to restore and protect those estuaries to address the worldwide challenge, the local challenge, the state challenge of climate change. So we applaud Anne Arundel County Executive Steuart Pittman for taking these two critical next steps. We will continue to fight and work hard throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And again, welcome to the foundation and to a real example of what a restored wetland can provide. It also serves as an education center. We bring thousands of students out on our canoes on a weekly basis to see the effects of wetland and to see the critters and the support that a wetland can give to any habitat and the protection that it gives to the bay. So again, welcome. I'd like to introduce Matt Johnson. Matt goes way back in the Chesapeake Bay program, and he has recently joined the county executive as the senior environmental liaison. So welcome, Matt, and welcome, County Executive Pittman.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa, and thanks everybody for coming out today. Let's just pause for a moment and not hear me talk, but hear everything around you. That is smart development. That's what smart development sounds like. You can hear the wildlife around us, the birds. This building behind you is a LEED Platinum, I believe, building. They moved into the critical area here along the Chesapeake Bay, and they did everything right. We've got non-tidal wetlands surrounding us, and today is all about making more smart development decisions like that. When the county executive hired me, I thought that after the first week, I'd be marching up to the county council with a handful of environmental bills. But as a matter of fact, what we did was we dug into our current laws and realized we are very lucky in Anne Arundel County because we have very strong environmental laws already on the books. But the key to those laws are enforcement. Laws are just words on paper unless we can figure out how to enforce them correctly. So to give you a sense of why we think that these two policies that the county executive will be announcing in just a moment are the correct way to enforce our laws, let me read directly from the code. I know, it may be boring, but it gets you into our head. Why we think this is so important. This is the policy statement that the county council developed years and years ago in our development article of the Anne Arundel County Code. The policy of the county is to establish standards for logical, sound, and economical development, and improve the quality of life through protection of the environment, including the prevention of air, water, light, and noise pollution, the prevention of soil erosion, and the preservation of natural features, and minimize adverse impacts on water quality, conserve plant, fish, and wildlife, and foster appropriate development activity for shoreline areas, and conserve and protect forests, woodlands, and trees. Those aren't our words. I wish they were. But the county council who came long before us knew what they were doing. And they told us this is the intent of the development article for Anne Arundel County. So given that intent, we sat down and we developed these two policies. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off here to County Executive Steuart Pittman, who can tell you about the first step in our efforts to bring back smart development and protect our natural resources.
Yeah, my dad always told me that a sacred obligation of us as human beings is to pass land on to the next generation in better condition than we found it. And we haven't always done that. But I saw getting elected as county executive as an opportunity to do that in Anne Arundel County. And last night I was at Arlington Echo speaking to a group of students who had done environmental art, and you could just feel it in the room that it's the young people who are going to be living with climate change. It's the young people who are going to finish our work cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay, and it's our responsibility as adults to keep the ball moving forward and make progress. So in Anne Arundel County, I think everybody understands, the voters certainly understand, that in order to clean up the bay, we have to address development. We have to think about what land we're paving over and where we're allowing nature to do its work, to absorb water. And so you may remember during my campaign, we had TV ads that had an image. I was out speaking at a place called Turnbull Estates down on the Mayo Peninsula, where they had just cut down a few acres of trees, and there was a stop work order from the Department of the Environment, Maryland Department of the Environment. They'd given them a grading permit to start building houses there, and the stop work order was because there were 3 wetlands there that had never been identified in the original applications for their permits, and they should never have cut down those trees. So the first of the new initiatives is, and I have to point out that these were done, Matt talking largely to Phil Hager, our planning director, who's here. Raise your hand, Phil. And let's give Phil a hand, because Phil has been, Phil has stepped up, and he understands the problem here. So it's a new guideline, and we're doing this we're not doing this just because it's going to work in the planning department, but we're putting this out publicly because we want the developers to know what the changes in the rules are. Because if you're in the business of development, it's business, and you need to know in advance. You need to be able to make plans, make a business plan. You can't make a business plan if you don't know what the rules are. And the rules are going to be enforced now, as Matt said. It's already the law of the land. But so verification of non-tidal wetlands and buffers. So the new policy is that when the developers put in their applications, they are not only going to have to say where the wetlands are, and we have believed them in the past. That's been the problem, is that it's up to them to identify and map the wetlands, and then we accept what they say without any kind of verification. So we're going to be verifying, but we're also going to ask Maryland Department of the Environment to do so as well, because they're the arbiters of the boundaries of wetlands in the state of Maryland. And over and over and over again, we've found that the applications aren't accurate. Nobody's checking up. So that's the first, simply policing the delineations of the wetlands in the applications. The second is broader. So when an application comes in for development and it doesn't quite fit the code, they put in requests for modifications, and modifications are simply asking for a waiver. And we're not opposed to all modifications because the code doesn't necessarily fit all situations. In fact, there are modifications that we've had that for watershed restoration projects that we've had to get to be able to improve stormwater management. But we want it to be known by the developers when they're putting in the applications that we are going to be very strict on any modification that impacts the environment. Article 17 says has significant protections to protect the environmental resources through the development review process, we're basically telling them that the practice of granting modifications has resulted in adverse environmental impacts and has run counter to the goals of effective planning. This administration will not facilitate such outcomes enabled through the modification process. So we're not saying never. We're saying that whenever there is an environmental issue, and we're talking about wetlands, we're talking about specimen trees, we're talking about steep slopes, and over again, more than ever, these have been issues in the applications, because the development in Anne Arundel County, the land that is easy to develop, that has no environmental problems, has mostly been developed. So often they're going into areas where it's more difficult. So we want them to know that they need to have a clear and definitive showing that any alternate proposal to mitigate the environmental impacts has to be justified, and it has to actually make things better rather than worse. And so there's some examples of already how this has worked. I'm proud to say that Phil Hager has already been thinking along these lines before we talked about putting a policy together and putting it out there. One example recently was, I think just Monday, a letter went out, a development by the Hogan Companies in Crofton called the Crofton Enclave. It's right at the entrance to the Crofton community. It's a beautiful pond on one side, and then there's a floodplain on the other. And the plan is to develop in the floodplain, multi-family housing. And the community, of course, has been opposed to this. I was at the original meeting where the engineer presented plans. And at that point, the engineer was very, very confident that this thing was going to go through. It was a done deal. They had waived the community meetings that they were supposed to have earlier in the process, which was a regular practice of the county in years past. No longer is the practice. And the community organized and got the attention of the previous county executive, and got the attention of Phil Hager. And everybody realized that this was a bad project, but not only bad in terms of traffic and all of the other problems with it, but the environment and being in a floodplain, having specimen trees, having steep slopes. And Monday's response by Phil Hager and his staff, there were dozens and dozens and dozens of problems with the application. And I think this is a case where the developer didn't really understand that there was new sheriff in town, new rules, and things are going to be different. So it's just one example of the way this is going to work. We don't know the outcome of that. They can come back and make amendments to their application, but we will see. The other thing I want to say is that there are going to be times, and there already have been some, where these developers who are land speculators, they purchase the land hoping to be able to get permits to build, even though it's questionable whether they should build there. They're going to make, these are bad investments. They're turning out to be bad investments in some cases. There's one in Glebe Heights where, also on the Mayo Peninsula, beautiful trees, a lot of wetlands, and the developer is not going to be able to build what he thought he was going to be able to build. And the question is whether we then bail the developer out. You may remember Turtle Run down in South County, where a developer illegally cut down a lot of trees. A previous county executive referred him for criminal prosecution. The next county executive put him on his transition team, and then ended up, when he couldn't build in the critical area where he wanted to build, he took $2.5 billion of our forest conservation money and purchased the land from him, which was a way of making him whole, bailing him out. This project in Glebe Heights has a similar situation where the developer and the previous county executive had talked about a land swap where we would give the developer developable land since he couldn't build on the land he was on. If we enforce our laws, taxpayers don't have to bail out developers when they make bad investments. So that's very important. So this is just the beginning. There's more coming in terms of actually changing some of the laws and sharpening our tools. We'll be working on the Forest Conservation Act, improving that. We have new environmental inspectors in our budget for inspections and permits. We're doing a study on the fiscal impacts of development that I believe will show us that smart growth is the way forward. Transit-oriented development is the way forward. We're not shutting the county down to growth. We had a large meeting a few weeks ago where we talked about smart growth and had Governor Glendening there, the father of smart growth. And we believe there's a way forward, but we need to protect the sensitive areas of the county, the natural beauty of Anne Arundel County, and protect our Chesapeake Bay.